She found out on a Thursday afternoon, when Ryan came home earlier than usual and tossed his keys onto the console table by the door. Not placed, but tossed, with that particular clatter that meant, this is going to be an unpleasant conversation. Alice was in the kitchen, holding a cup of lukewarm tea, watching him through the doorway. Something inside her clenched before he even opened his mouth. In 4 years, she had learned to read him the moment he walked in by the slope of his shoulders, by the way he took off his coat, hanging it carefully, or slinging it over the back of a chair. That day, he slung it. "We need to talk," he said, not looking at her. She set her cup down, quietly, almost silently. "I'm listening." He walked into the living room and sat in the armchair. His armchair, the one Alice never sat in, not because he forbade it, but because she had long ago accepted the unspoken hierarchy of things. He sat with his arms crossed, staring somewhere past her. "I've met someone else," he said, his voice even, almost businesslike, as if announcing a change in their cell phone plan. "We haven't been what we should be for a long time. I think you know that, too." Alice was silent. A ridiculous, completely unrelated thought surfaced. On the table lay her unfinished article about the New York hospitality scene. It was a freelance piece, due Monday. She thought that she would have to finish it. Her brain clung to that thought like a life raft, because the rest of it, Ryan's words, his relaxed posture, his someone else, was all too enormous to process at once. "Who?" she asked, and her voice sounded calm, too calm. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." He raised his eyes to her, a look she remembered well. Mild irritation mixed with superiority, the look of a man tired of stupid questions. "Chloe," he said. "You don't know her. The daughter of Andrew Zimmerman, one of my clients. She's 26. Alice heard every word. Chloe. 26. A client's daughter. The 3 facts landed one by one, like blows. She was 34. She had lived with this man for 4 years and, in that moment, understood that in his system of coordinates, this was only a matter of time. "Are you leaving?" she asked. He paused for a beat. "This apartment is in my name. I took out the mortgage before we were married. You know that, right?" She knew. She had known for a long time. She just never thought that this fact would one day stand up to its full height and become a verdict. "How much time do I have?" "I think you could pack your things this weekend." 2 days. He was giving her 2 days. 4 years of life and 2 days to pack. Alice nodded. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because the tears would come later. In a rented room in Bushwick, where the walls smelled of someone else's life and cheap paint. In that moment, she only nodded, turned, and walked out of the living room. She stopped at the doorway. "You could have told me sooner," she said, without turning around. "What would that have changed?" He called out from behind her. She didn't answer. She just walked into the bedroom and started to pull a suitcase down from the top shelf of the closet. The story, however, hadn't begun as a tragedy. It had begun the way all stories that later cause the most pain begin. Beautifully. Alice was 29 when they met at a party hosted by mutual friends. One of those Soho loft parties where it's hard to tell who is who. Everyone is roughly the same age, from roughly the same circle, all talking at once and drinking something sparkling from tall flutes. The hosts were excitedly talking about their recent trip to Tulum. Someone put on some jazz. Alice stood by the window with her glass, looking down at the rain-slicked street below. The streetlights, blurred by the drizzle, cast yellow halos on the black asphalt, and the silence behind the glass seemed impossible against the party's noise. "You're the only person in this room looking out there, instead of in here," someone said beside her. She turned. Ryan Peterson was the kind of man you remember. Tall, well-dressed in a dark blazer and a white shirt with no tie. The top button was undone just enough to look both careless and deliberate. An open face, with that particular confidence that doesn't intimidate but attracts. He was in his early 30s. His smile was slow, as if he intentionally paused before smiling, so you had time to notice he was about to do it. "It's more interesting out there," she replied simply, than another conversation about Tulum for the 3rd time tonight. He laughed a real, short laugh, without any pretense. "Ryan," he said, extending his hand. "Alice. What are you doing here if it's more interesting out there?" She thought for a second. Waiting for the right moment to leave. "And what if I asked you not to leave?" It was an easy line to read, maybe a little cliché, but he said it in a way that stripped the cliché away. All that remained was the fact that he was looking at her, attentively and seriously. Not the way you look at a stranger at a party, but the way you look at a person you want to remember. She stayed. They talked until almost midnight, standing by that same window. She told him about her job at a small digital magazine, about how she had long wanted to try writing something of her own, not just articles for other publications, but something real, alive. He listened the way very few men know how to listen, not waiting for a pause to insert his own story, but truly listening, his head tilted slightly, occasionally asking a short, precise question. He was in real estate development, he said briefly, had his own boutique firm. Nothing special, just a job. Alice would later remember that this was the first sign. He knew how to downplay himself at the right moment, creating the impression that the person he was talking to was more interesting, more significant. It was a talent, a very convenient one. They parted at her doorstep. He called her an Uber, gave her his number, said he would call, and he did, the very next day. The 3 months of courtship were, to be honest, flawless. He knew how to surprise her without being tacky. Not a cliché bouquet of flowers, but a single, dark crimson rose bought from a bodega and handed to her for no reason at all. Not a flashy restaurant for the sake of it, but a tiny Italian place in the West Village he knew from years ago, where they sat at a corner table under a low light, and talked for 3 hours straight. He remembered details what she had said during their last meeting, a movie she had mentioned, the fact that she didn't eat cilantro. It felt like attentiveness. Later, Alice would realize it was something else. Data collection, mapping her terrain. But back then, it felt like attentiveness. When he asked her to move in with him, they had been dating for 6 months. She agreed without much thought. The pre-war apartment on the Upper West Side, handsome and spacious, with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, was impressive. Ryan lived alone, was neat, knew how to make risotto, and never left dirty dishes in the sink. Alice's parents lived in Syracuse. Her mother was thrilled that her daughter had settled down. Her friends were envious, in a good way. Everything was falling into place. The wedding was a year after they met. Small, about 40 people, a chic restaurant in Midtown. A white dress with a simple silhouette. She didn't like ornate things, she chose elegance. Ryan looked at her that day in a way that took her breath away. Her mother cried tears of joy. The photos turned out beautifully. Alice would later look at those pictures and think, here, I still didn't know. Here, and here, too. The first bell, not alarming, more strange, rang about 3 months after the wedding. Alice was meeting her friend Jessica. They had known each other since college, and didn't see each other often. But their friendship was warm. They stayed late at a cafe on Bleecker Street, talking about everything. Alice got home around 9:30, an hour later than she'd planned. Ryan was sitting in the living room. The TV was off. He wasn't reading, not looking at his phone, just sitting. "Why didn't you let me know you'd be late?" he asked. "I sent you a text, you didn't reply." "Jessica and I just got caught up talking," Alice said, taking off her jacket. "Caught up talking?" He said the word strangely, with a slight irony, as if they required quotation marks. "Ryan, we had a lot to talk about. We hadn't seen each other in 3 months." "Got it." The conversation was over. No fight, no raised voices. Just that short, clipped, "got it," with a chill inside it. She decided he was tired, that he'd had a hard day, that she shouldn't have been late and should have called. That night, she apologized first. Later, she wondered why. The following months moved at their own pace. Ryan worked a lot, came home late, sometimes in a wonderful mood, sometimes withdrawn. Alice continued to work at the magazine, writing her column. In the evenings, they had dinner together, or not, if he was late. On the surface, everything looked normal, but inside, on some intuitive level, something was subtly shifting. The first concrete episode, the one she would later privately call the beginning, happened on a November evening in their 2nd year of marriage. Alice had written a major piece, one she had spent weeks on. It wasn't a commissioned article, it was her own. A long-form story about New York entrepreneurs, the ones who had started from scratch during the dot-com bubble and built something real. She had conducted interviews, traveled for meetings, recorded, and structured the narrative. It was the first thing in a long time that she was truly passionate about professionally. She printed a draft, 120 pages, with her notes and bookmarks made from paper strips, as she always did. That Friday evening, Ryan came home early, in a good mood, with a bottle of wine. He suggested they go to his friends Ben and Olivia's for dinner. "I can't tonight," Alice said. "I want to finish this section while the ideas are fresh." "What section?" "The 4th chapter. It has the interview with Mr. Bell, and I want to structure the inserts correctly." Ryan picked up the manuscript from the table without asking. Just picked it up, flipped through a few pages. "And what are you planning to do with this?" he asked. Finish it, then try pitching it to the Atlantic or the New Yorker. He placed the manuscript back down with a light, almost dismissive sound. Alice, they won't take this. Why not? Because it's amateurish. Look at the length, the structure. It's not the right format for a serious publication. You're just wasting your time. She felt a prickle inside. Not painful yet, but noticeable. You read 3 pages. That was enough. Don't be offended, I'm just being honest. Better me than getting a rejection and being disappointed. I'm not offended, she said. I just don't agree with your assessment. He shrugged. Fine. Are we going to Ben's? She went. They spent the evening at their friend's place, and everything was fine. Ryan was charming and witty, as always in company. And Alice almost forgot about their conversation. Almost. She never finished the manuscript. Not because he forbade it, he didn't. It was just that every time she sat down to work on it, something interfered. A voice in her head, his voice, his intonation. It's amateurish. They won't take it. At first, she argued with it. Then she stopped. By the end of their 2nd year of marriage, Ryan started saying things she initially took for concern. Why do you even have that job at the magazine? They pay you pennies and it's all stress. Stay home, find a hobby. Then, why do you spend so much time with those friends? You're a grown woman, not a college student. Then, you look ridiculous in that. Honestly, Alice. It's not your style. She was wearing a new dress then, dark green, festive. She had loved it. She took it off, hung it back in the closet, and later gave it to a friend. The heaviest and most destructive thing wasn't any single act of cruelty. It was the accumulation of small, systematic, almost unnoticeable slights. He didn't hit her, didn't insult her crudely, didn't yell. He was more subtle. A light mockery of her opinion in front of others. Alice here is an expert on everything, said with a smile, as if it were a joke. Or, there you go again. Do you even understand what you're talking about? Quietly, almost softly. So you couldn't argue. So you started to think, maybe I really don't understand. There was one evening she remembered vividly. Ryan invited 3 business partners over. A dinner meeting. She set the table, everything proper. At one point, the conversation turned to real estate, the market, and Alice, who by then was thinking about her own small venture, a content agency, and was writing a business plan in drafts, interjected something about a model for working with smaller developers on content and promotion. She said maybe 3 sentences. Just adding to the conversation. Ryan looked at her, then at his partners, and laughed. Alice is our strategist, he said, with that intonation that turned the word into a taunt. She's been writing a column for a digital magazine for 3 years. Now she knows how to build a business. The men smiled politely. One of them, Greg, a portly man in a nice suit, even said something like, well, why not? The idea is interesting. But Ryan had already steered the conversation elsewhere, and it was as if nothing had happened. Alice finished her water, got up from the table, and excused herself to tend to something in the kitchen. In the kitchen, she stood by the window, looking at the streetlights. The normal world outside. Inside her, it was quiet and wrong. After the guests left, Ryan washed the dishes. He did that sometimes. A gesture of goodwill. Why did you butt into that conversation? He asked, without turning around. I just said what I thought. Alice, these are serious business people. It's a different level. You embarrassed them with your little project. Greg said the idea was interesting. Greg is a polite man. She fell silent. He dried his hands and went to the bedroom. She remained standing by the sink. She had almost stopped seeing her mother by their 3rd year of marriage. Not because Ryan directly forbade it, that would have been too crude, too obvious. He just always found a reason. We have Ben and Olivia coming this weekend. Did you forget? Your mom can wait. Or, are you seriously driving to Syracuse for 3 days? Who's going to feed me? Said with a laugh. But the laugh had a demand inside it. Why do you have to call her every week? She's not sick. She doesn't need you that often. Her mother would call. Alice would speak to her briefly if Ryan was home, longer if he wasn't. Then she noticed she was timing her calls to his schedule and didn't understand when that had become normal. The manuscript disappeared in April of their 3rd year. Alice came home from work and reached for the printout. It wasn't on the table. She checked a drawer, a shelf, nothing. Ryan, have you seen my papers? A stack of printed pages. I threw it out, he said, not looking up from his laptop. Threw what out? The table was a mess. It had been lying there for half a year, so it must not have been important. Alice stared at him. That was my work. It was clutter taking up space. Ryan, there were 120 pages. I spent 6 months on that. Alice, he looked at her over his laptop. You know it wasn't going anywhere. You didn't even believe in it yourself, or you would have sent it somewhere by now. I did you a favor. She stood in the doorway of his study, unable to say a word. Not because she had nothing to say, but the opposite. There was too much, all at once, a knot in her throat. She just turned and walked away. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Ryan slept beside her, peacefully, without a hint of remorse. Alice stared at the ceiling and thought, I think I hate him. And almost immediately after, no, I'm just not understanding something. He's probably right. The manuscript probably was bad. It was called gaslighting. She would learn the word later, a year after the divorce, after stumbling upon an article online. She would read it, reread it, sit down at her table, and slowly drink a glass of water. Then she would type a few more words into the search bar and discover that everything she had considered her own inadequacy, her failures, her inability to be a normal wife, all had another name and another explanation. But that would come later. Chloe appeared in his life, Alice later calculated, about 6 months before the conversation in the living room. Andrew Zimmerman, Ryan's client, had started inviting Ryan to his country club on Sundays to play tennis. His daughter would sometimes show up there, young, effervescent, unmarried. It was all easy, close, convenient. Alice suspected nothing. By then, she had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. That too was a result of 3 years. Not of a harsh prohibition, but of a slow training, teaching her that her questions were a nuisance, a sign of suspicion, of unhealthy behavior. There you go with your controlling again, when she simply asked what time he'd be back. You're like an interrogator. When she just noticed an unfamiliar number on his phone. She learned not to ask, and therefore, she didn't know. On Saturday, as she packed her suitcase, Ryan was in the living room, watching football. He didn't offer to help, didn't show any awkwardness. He only glanced into the bedroom once to say, "Leave the TV in here, it's mine." "I wasn't planning on taking it," Alice replied. She packed her clothes, books, laptop, a few things from the bathroom into 2 suitcases and a backpack. She looked around the room 4 years of her life and realized she didn't want to spend another second there. That was probably the only thing she was grateful to him for later. He didn't give her the option to stay. At the doorway, she turned back. He was standing in the hallway, hands in his pockets, calm. "You were never on my level," he said. Without cruelty, almost wearily, like a statement of fact. "I just put up with it for too long." Alice looked at him for a long time, attentively. The way one looks at a stranger, for the first time without the fear of being judged for that look. "Be happy, Ryan," she said, and left. The first 2 months were a blur she barely remembered. A rented room in Bushwick. The landlady, an elderly woman with a cat, didn't ask questions. Rent was due on the 1st. The rest wasn't her business. The room was small, with one window overlooking a courtyard where an old birch tree grew. Alice would wake up, look at the birch, drink coffee, and think that she needed to do something. Then she would lie back down. She went to her job at the magazine on autopilot, wrote her articles, came back, ate whatever she could find. Her mother called every day, suggesting she come to Syracuse. "Stay with us for a while, rest." Alice refused, not out of pride, but because she couldn't even explain to herself what was happening to her. She was whole, physically intact, not starving, employed, but inside there was something like a void. Not sharp, but dull, like a pain you've had for so long, you stop noticing it. One night, she couldn't sleep and thought about the manuscript, about those 120 pages, and suddenly realized she couldn't remember what it was about. She remembered a few sentences, the names of some of the people she interviewed, but the structure itself, the one she had carefully crafted, had dissolved. Ryan had thrown out the physical copy, and Alice hadn't finished organizing the digital version. She had left it in drafts, and now, when she opened the folder, she saw only fragments. She didn't cry about it. She just sat at her desk and stared at the screen. Jessica called in November. They hadn't seen each other for almost a year, since that evening on Bleecker Street after which Alice had trained herself to see her friends less often. Jessica had heard about the divorce from mutual acquaintances. She called and said, "I'm not prying, just letting you know I'm here." Alice paused, then replied, "Let's meet." They sat in the same cafe on Bleecker Street. Jessica didn't interrogate her, she just listened. Alice spoke. At first cautiously, then more, then a lot, as if a tap that had been shut off for a long time had finally been opened. About the manuscript, about the public humiliation in front of his partners, about whispering to her mother on the phone so Ryan wouldn't hear, about the dress she gave away because he said it looked ridiculous. Jessica listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "Alice, there are words for this. You know that, right?" "I know. I found out recently." "And what are you going to do with that?" Alice held her cup, warm, almost hot. "Live," she said. "There are no other options." She found the job by chance, through a friend of a friend. A small content agency, Wordsmith, was hiring remote writers. Alice wrote a test piece, 3 articles in 3 days. They hired her. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. She wrote website copy, articles, sometimes press releases. It wasn't what she had dreamed of, but it was hers, entirely hers, without anyone's opinion on where it was going. 4 months later, they offered her a staff position as an editor. Then they gave her her first client to manage, then a second. She worked a lot. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the work gave her a feeling she had almost forgotten. "I am doing something I'm good at. It's needed. It works." By the following spring, she rented her own apartment, a small 1-bedroom in Yorkville, on the top floor with a view of a park. When she paid the first month's rent with her own money, earned by herself, she just stood by the window and looked at the trees. She didn't say anything out loud, just memorized the feeling. Mark Sterling appeared in her life about 8 months after she moved into the Yorkville apartment. By then, Alice was no longer a salaried editor at Wordsmith. She had started her own business, gathered a small team of 3 writers she knew personally, and began operating as an agency. It was simply called Krylov and Associates, after her maiden name, which she had taken back after the divorce. Sterling called through an agency portal. His company, Sterling Properties, needed a marketing campaign for a new residential complex outside the city. The task was not trivial. The target audience was families. The values were space, security, community. Not just square footage. Alice took the call herself, spoke for 20 minutes, and realized the project was interesting. They scheduled a meeting. He came to her small office in the Flatiron district himself, without an assistant, without an entourage. This was surprising. A man in his mid-40s, athletic, in a well-made but not flashy suit, with a manner of speaking directly and listening the same way. Alice gave a short presentation. He asked questions, precise and to the point. Not a single rhetorical one. When she finished, he looked at the layout on the screen and said, "This is the first time in 3 meetings with agencies that someone has shown me a concept instead of a visual template." "That's because the concept comes first," Alice replied. "I agree. We're in business." They signed the contract a week later. The first month was purely professional interaction, meetings, revisions, approvals. Alice saw that he was attentive to detail and had no patience for vague formulations, but he never pressured her, giving her team space to make their own decisions. It was unfamiliar. One day, after a work meeting, as she was packing up her laptop, he asked, "Have you had dinner?" She looked up. "Not yet." "Me neither. There's a decent place nearby, if you don't mind." She didn't mind. Dinner lasted 2 hours. They talked about work at first, then about the city, what it was like 20 years ago, and what it had become. About books, they unexpectedly discovered a shared favorite author. About what it means to build something of your own in the current climate, not complaining, just observing reality. He didn't ask about her personal life. Neither did she. It felt good. No pressure, no interrogation, just 2 people who enjoyed talking to each other. He called 3 days later, not about work, but just to say, "I found that book we were talking about. Want me to drop it off sometime?" She replied, "I'd like that." The next few months, she got used to the idea that you could feel like yourself next to a man. That your opinion was taken seriously. That if you said something in a business meeting, he didn't look at you with irony and change the subject. That you could call your mother in front of him and no one would act annoyed. She got used to it slowly, cautiously, periodically expecting a catch, the way an experienced animal that remembers danger does. There was no catch. There was Mark, mature, stable, a little reserved when it came to himself, but completely open when it came to her. He liked her, she could see that. And this liking was different, not possessive, not a collector's impulse, but the kind that asks for nothing in return. One Friday evening, late, as Alice was at home with a cup of coffee, editing a draft, he called. "There's a wedding tomorrow," he said without preamble. "A business partner, an old acquaintance. I promised I'd be there. Will you come with me? Some important people will be there, and you might have some fun." "Whose wedding?" she asked. Will Zimmerman is getting married. You don't know him. Zimmerman. The name didn't register. Alice thought for a second. Okay, she said. I'll be ready by 6. Great. See you tomorrow then. She put her phone down and went back to the draft. It was raining outside. There was no premonition. The next morning, she woke up before her alarm. The sun was already filtering through the linen curtains, casting long rectangles of light on the floor. Alice lay for a few minutes, listening to the quiet of her apartment. Saturday. The park outside was making a gentle, rustling sound. Somewhere far away, a car honked. The day promised to be warm, one of those rare mid-autumn days when the sky suddenly remembers it isn't tired of being clear yet. She got up and put on coffee. While she showered, the aroma filled the small apartment. On the desk in her small office lay an open folder with documents, edits for a new text she needed to give her writer, Kevin, on Monday. Alice looked at the folder, closed it, and set it aside. No work today. Tonight, there was an evening out. She didn't think of the wedding as anything special. Mark's partner, an old acquaintance. A celebration like any other. Important people, a nice restaurant. A few hours in good company. She had been to events like this over the past year. Business dinners, presentations, a couple of client holiday parties where Mark had brought her along as a matter of course. She knew how to navigate these spaces, to carry herself with ease, to speak to the point, to not feel lost in an unfamiliar crowd. 2 years ago, she hadn't had this skill. Or rather, she had, but it was buried under such a thick layer of someone else's judgments that it was almost undetectable. 2 years. She thought about it sometimes. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet astonishment. How different 2 years could be, depending on whom you spend them with. In one set of 2 years, you can become smaller. In another, you can reclaim yourself. The dress had been hanging on her closet door since Thursday. She had taken it out in advance, checking for any creases or snags. It was a deep red, almost burgundy in the shadows and a true, vibrant red in the light. Mark had brought it back from Milan in March. Just because, for no occasion, which was his style. Gifts without anniversaries or holidays, but because he saw something and thought of her. The dress was made of heavy silk, with an open back and a simple, clean cut that demanded a confident posture. On the hanger, it looked modest. On her, it was something else. Alice took a shower, dried her hair, and styled it herself. A few years ago, she would have gone to a salon, been nervous, had it redone. Now, she just took a brush, a hairdryer, and pinned a section of hair at her temple with a small bobby pin topped with a tiny pearl. Her hair fell in a soft wave, just below her shoulders. Her makeup was understated. Foundation that matched her skin tone, a little emphasis on her cheekbones, lips a dark rose, almost neutral. She disliked heavy evening makeup. It always felt more like a mask than an enhancement. She put on the dress, half an hour before Mark was due to arrive. She zipped up the thin side zipper, adjusted the neckline, and turned to the mirror. In the mirror stood a woman she recognized. It sounded cliché, and she knew it, but she still paused on that thought every time. Recognized not in the sense of, that's my reflection, but in a deeper, more important sense. Here I am, the one who is capable, the one who decides, the one who is going out tonight to a place she wants to go, with whom she wants, in what she wants. And no one would tell her it was ridiculous or not her style. She dabbed a little perfume on her wrists, Narciso Rodriguez. The bottle sat on her vanity. Dark glass, a subtle scent, something warm with notes of wood and white musk. She put on her shoes, black heels with a thin ankle strap. She took her clutch, a small, black leather one, and transferred the essentials, phone, keys, credit card, lipstick. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Mark was in a dark gray suit with a white shirt. No tie. He rarely wore one, said it was an anachronism. He looked at her for a second, silently, with that gaze that, even after months, still made her lose her balance a little. Ready? He asked. Ready. He held the building's door for her, then the car door. Not for show, not theatrically, just the way one does things. The car was black, quiet inside, with a leather interior that smelled good, a little of leather, a little of something citrusy and woody. She had never figured out what it was, but the scent of this car had long become an association with calmness for her. They drove toward Midtown. New York on a Saturday evening was in its best form. Not bustling like on weekdays, but unhurried, illuminated, with lights in shop windows and couples on the sidewalks. Mark occasionally said something about the host of the party, Will, being an old acquaintance from his first development projects. He's a boisterous guy, loves a big show. Be prepared for a live band and toasts until midnight. She laughed. He held her hand on the center console, just holding it, without pressure. The way you hold something you're used to holding. George Stroyer will be there, Mark said, turning onto Park Avenue. We started negotiations on a project with him last week. I want to introduce you. Useful connection. And it seems he needs people for content marketing for a new complex. Tell me more. I'll tell you later, when we see him. I don't want to be imprecise with the details. She nodded. Outside the window, the city floated by. Familiar avenues, streetlights reflected in the wet asphalt. The rain had passed in the afternoon, but puddles remained. Dark mirrors in which the sky trembled. The car turned off Park Avenue, then again, and Alice suddenly saw a familiar street perspective. A wide sidewalk, old linden trees along the road. Ahead, the facade of a building with a sign she remembered. The Starlight Room. She had been here twice. The first time for her magazine's holiday party, the second with Ryan for their third anniversary. He had chosen the place himself, said the food was good, and he knew the sommelier. The evening had gone well then. One of the few she remembered without bitterness. They had even danced toward the end, after some wine. And for a few hours, Ryan had become that charming man from the Soho party again. Something tightened inside her. A quick, sharp pang, like when you accidentally touch a wound that hasn't healed. She looked away. Don't. It was just a coincidence. The restaurant was large, popular. They host countless events here. It has nothing to do with him. Mark parked in a lot around the corner and killed the engine. Everything okay? He asked. He knew how to sense her pauses. Yes, she said. Just thinking. They got out. The evening air was cool, with a faint smell of damp leaves and something melon-like from a nearby courtyard. Alice took Mark's arm. He squeezed her elbow slightly, a familiar gesture she loved for its subtlety. Two people stood at the entrance. A man in a tuxedo with a boutonniere, clearly a guest, and a young woman in a long, silver dress. They nodded to Mark, and he exchanged a brief handshake with the man. Alice smiled. They went inside. The lobby greeted them with warmth and a low hum of voices. The Starlight Room was laid out with a wide entrance, a coat check to the right, and then an arched entryway that opened into the main hall. Fresh flowers, white lilies and branches with small white blossoms, stood in tall floor vases on either side of the arch. A light, sweet fragrance filled the air. Alice checked her coat, smoothed her dress, and took her clutch. Mark was beside her, saying something to the attendant about parking. She looked at the archway, beyond which she could already see people, lights, and the white tablecloths of the tables. They entered. The hall was full, but not crowded. 100 people, maybe a few more, spread out in a large space with high ceilings. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft, muted light. In the corners, live trees and planters were adorned with white flowers. On a small stage at the far end of the room, a string quartet played something quiet and waltz-like. Along the far wall was a long buffet table with appetizers and champagne in silver buckets. The guests were dressed up, mostly an older crowd, 40 plus, with a few younger faces. The overall tone was that of a corporate celebration, not wild, but without stiff formality. Alice scanned the room. It was a professional habit. She always surveyed a space before engaging. She noted details automatically. Dark wood tabletops, napkins folded like lilies, menus in leather, bound folders. Her gaze briefly settled on an older woman by the window in a beige blazer. Something familiar about her profile, the way she held her glass. Alice tensed. Aunt Val, Ryan's aunt, his mother's sister. Alice had been to her birthday parties a few times, winter gatherings in an apartment on the Upper East Side that was always filled with smoke and noise. Aunt Val wore the same powdery perfume, told loud stories, and had always treated Alice with a sour politeness. Not hostile, but without warmth. So, there were people here connected to Ryan. Alice looked away, waited a second, two, and then scanned the room again, this time methodically. By the buffet, a man she'd seen at one of Ryan's corporate events. By the window, a young, unfamiliar couple. At a central table, another face she was sure she'd seen before. Her heart lurched. She thought, maybe it's just a resemblance. Maybe it's not him. Then she looked toward the ceremonial arch, white and adorned with fresh roses and greenery, where the groom was supposed to be waiting, and she saw Ryan. He was standing with his back to the entrance, talking to a short, stocky man in a black tuxedo. He was in a tuxedo too, a dark navy one, perfectly tailored, with a white boutonniere. Ryan had hardly changed. The same straight shoulders, the same confident posture, the same slightly lifted chin that Alice had once privately called his master of the universe pose. His hair was a little shorter than she remembered. She stood motionless, not because her feet wouldn't move, but because her brain had performed an immense amount of work in a single second. It had identified, connected, and built a chain of logic. Zimmerman. Will Zimmerman, the son of Andrew Zimmerman, Ryan's client, whose daughter was Chloe. Which meant the bride's brother was getting married. Which meant Ryan wasn't here as a guest. Ryan was here as. Mark gently touched her arm. There's George. 1 second, she said. He looked at her. She could feel his gaze, but she was looking straight ahead at Ryan, who at that very moment turned around. Their eyes met. For the first half-second, it was just a glance, a collision, like with strangers who happened to look in the same direction. Then, something in his pupils clicked. He recognized her. Alice saw it happen. Frame by frame, almost in slow motion. First, confusion, barely perceptible. He was good at hiding his emotions, but for that first moment, he wasn't fast enough. Then, full, undeniable recognition. And following that, what she knew so well. A flush creeping up his neck, a clenched jaw, a quick glance left and right to see if anyone was watching. His lower lip tucked in slightly. He was stunned. Alice took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. The movement was smooth, natural, as if it were the sole purpose of her existence at that moment. She took a small sip, her expression polite and calm, the way one looks at a well-organized event where there is no cause for concern. Mark finally noticed something in her posture. Do you know someone here? He asked quietly. The bride's family, she said, just as quietly. That's Ryan. My ex-husband. A short pause. Do you want to leave? She thought. 1 heartbeat. 2, no, she said. He nodded, without another word. That was his way. Not to make more of a situation than it was, not to escalate, not to instruct. He placed his hand on her back, just below her shoulder blades, where the dress was open. Warm, steady. A gesture that said, I'm here. That was enough. Then let's go say hello to George, he said in a normal voice. He's over there, by the window. George Stroyer turned out to be a short, round-faced man with a professional knack for being both pleasant and assessing. He shook Alice's hand firmly, looking at her attentively. Mark introduced her. Alice Krylov, head of the agency I'm working with. George's face lit up, and he began to ask questions. She answered clearly, concisely, professionally. In the back of her mind, she noted that Ryan was no longer looking her way. He was talking to his companion in the black tuxedo again, but his posture had changed, becoming less open, slightly tense. She didn't look at him for too long. That was important. The guests were taking their seats. The noise in the hall was settling into that specific quality hum that precedes a formal ceremony. The quartet changed its tune to something more solemn and slow. A few couples walked to their places. Alice and Mark stood slightly away from their table, not in a hurry. It was at that moment that 2 people approached the ceremonial arch. The MC, a woman in her 40s in an elegant black dress holding a microphone, and a photographer, who began to back away, framing his shot. The movement in the hall stilled. The MC said something into the microphone about a happy day and asked the guests to turn their attention to the entrance. The doors opened. Alice turned along with everyone else. Chloe was walking toward the arch, alone, or almost alone. Beside her was an older man whom Alice immediately recognized as Andrew Zimmerman, her father. Short, in a fine suit, with the same restrained pride in his eyes that Ryan had in his best moments. Chloe was truly beautiful. She was exactly as Alice had imagined her. Young, light, with that unguarded openness that people have at 26 and can lose forever if they're not careful. Her dress was white, with crystals on the bodice, and a long train. Her veil was as light as a breath. Her hair was swept up. Chloe walked and smiled, a little shyly, a little joyfully, the way brides smile. This Day aren't yet tired of the celebration and aren't thinking about what comes next. Ryan watched her from the arch. And the expression on his face, Alice could see from the side, was genuine. He knew how to be sincere in the right moments. She knew that, too. A few guests pulled out their phones. Someone let out a soft gasp of admiration. Aunt Val in her beige blazer dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Alice looked at this scene, this beautiful, flawlessly constructed picture of someone else's celebration, and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not envy, not bitterness. Just a strange, almost physical distance, the way you look at photos from someone else's past and realize they no longer concern you. That, perhaps, was the best thing she felt all evening. The ceremony lasted about half an hour. Rings, vows, applause. Alice stood next to Mark. He quietly commented on one of the toasts. She smiled. The entire time, she never made eye contact with Ryan. Not because she was avoiding it, but because there was no need. When the guests started moving toward their tables, Alice noticed something that would not have escaped an attentive observer. Several older women, clearly from Ryan's side of the family, were glancing her way. Not with hostility, but with a sharp curiosity. They recognized her, of course. In the small town called family, everyone knows and remembers everything. One of them, an older woman with an elaborate updo and pearl earrings, whispered something to her neighbor without taking her eyes off Alice. The neighbor glanced over, then looked away. Alice didn't hear the words, but she read the situation effortlessly. She straightened her back and took Mark's arm a little more firmly. "Let's go to our table," he said. "Yes," she replied. They walked across the hall, and Alice walked the way she had learned to walk in the last 2 years, unhurried, without looking around, without bowing her head. In the dim hall, the deep red dress seemed to glow. She knew this. She knew that several pairs of eyes were following her. Including, she could feel on her skin, one pair from the side where the groom stood. Ryan was watching her. She didn't look back. There were 7 of them at the table. Mark and Alice, George and his wife, a slender woman with a short haircut, an elderly man introduced as Nicholas Evans, and a young architect named Arthur, whom Mark clearly knew from work. The conversation at the table was varied. The suburban real estate market, last year's Architectural Digest design show. George told a funny story about his first project in the 90s. Alice joined the conversation easily. She asked Arthur about one of his projects she'd seen in a professional journal. He brightened and began to explain. Mark watched her from the corner of his eye. She knew that look. It held something akin to pleasure. The waiters brought appetizers, thin slices of salmon on rye crackers, marinated artichokes, carpaccio with arugula. The quartet began to play again. Quietly, in the background. A few couples got up to dance. "Shall we dance?" Mark asked. "A little later," she replied. "Let me finish my artichoke." He laughed. Everything was fine. It was exactly what someone else's celebration should be, where you feel comfortable and no one owes you anything. Alice ate her artichoke, listened to Nicholas Evans, watched the dancers, and slowly, the tension that had arisen at the entrance began to dissipate. Later, they did dance. A slow dance, a bit old-fashioned, to a live violin playing a soft waltz. Mark led confidently and without pretense. He was a good dancer, but not a show-off. Alice placed her hand on his shoulder. He held her by the waist. Close, warm. They moved in time with the music. A few other couples twirled nearby, including the newlyweds, Ryan and Chloe. He was whispering something in her ear, and she was laughing. Alice tried not to look in their direction. It wasn't always possible. She realized he was looking at her before their eyes met again. It was the same feeling as at the beginning of the evening, like a prick between her shoulder blades that you can't see but can already feel. Ryan was standing at the edge of the dance floor. He had either lost the rhythm of the dance, or had stopped deliberately, and was staring in their direction. Chloe was saying something to him. He was nodding, but his gaze was elsewhere. In his eyes was something Alice knew how to read well. Anger. Not a sharp, sudden anger, but an old, accumulated one. The kind a person feels when they don't get what they expected and can't accept the discrepancy. She didn't look away first. Ryan did. The evening moved into its second hour. The main course was served, beef short ribs in a wine sauce with potato puree and asparagus spears. Another bottle of wine was brought. George raised a toast to the newlyweds, then to business, then, a little unexpectedly, to all the smart women, without whom we couldn't have built anything, looking at Alice as he spoke. She raised her glass with a slight smile. Mark excused himself to go to the bar. He had seen an old friend. "1 minute," he said to her and walked off, weaving between the tables. Alice sat alone, watching the stage. The quartet had picked up the tempo. Someone started clapping along. George was talking to Nicholas Evans about taxes. She sensed him before she saw him. Ryan approached from her right, unhurriedly, with the confident stride of someone who feels entitled to speak. He sat down in the empty chair next to her, Mark's chair, without asking. It was completely his style. "Long time no see," he said quietly. His voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something hot, like the smooth surface above smoldering peat. Alice looked at him calmly. "What the hell are you doing here, Ryan?" He said through his teeth, so quietly that the neighbors couldn't hear. but with such concentration that the words reached her with perfect clarity. Was this on purpose? Did someone call you? Who told you? I'm here with. Don't, he cut her off. I see what's going on. You found out I would be here and you came. You just can't get over me, can you? It's been 2 years, and you're still. Ryan, she said, her voice quiet but very clear. I didn't know you would be here. I came with Mark at his invitation. He's a business partner of Will's father. He stared at her, and she could see he didn't believe her, or didn't want to. And that dress, he said, and his tone held a familiar, repulsive mix of mockery and superiority. Dressed in red for someone else's wedding. Drawing all the attention to yourself. You can't help but make a scene, even here. Alice didn't answer right away. She held a pause, a second, 2, looking at the glass in her hand. Who did you come with? He asked, and now there was a new note in his voice. Curiosity mixed with something unpleasant. Who is this Mark? Just another guy you're trying to impress? I'm here with my husband, she said calmly. He fell silent. He looked at her, clearly expecting her to smile, to clarify, to correct herself. What husband? You're not married. You're mistaken. Ryan leaned back slightly. A flicker of something crossed his face. Confusion? Calculation? He glanced toward the bar. Mark was standing there, his back to them, talking to 2 men. Tall. In a good gray suit, confident. Ryan watched him for a few seconds. Alice saw something in his face change. Not immediately, but slowly, like a photograph developing. He recognized him. It was noticeable in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his right hand clenched on the edge of the table. Alice didn't know then what exactly Ryan knew about Mark Sterling or how deeply that knowledge pierced him at that moment. She just saw the face of a man who had just received information that changed all his calculations. He started. Yes, Alice said. She picked up her glass, sipped her champagne, calm and steady, like a woman who belongs here. Ryan stared at her, and something was building in his eyes, anger, humiliation, that old, familiar need to say something destructive, to reclaim the superior position. Alice saw it happening. She knew the mechanism all too well. His mouth opened, and at that moment, a hand appeared over her shoulder, a familiar, calm hand, and placed a glass of water on the table. Mark was back. He didn't sit down. He stood, his hand resting on the back of his chair, the one Ryan was sitting in, and looked down at him. Without a word, just looking. Ryan slowly raised his gaze. For a few seconds, they were silent. Alice held her glass, feeling the air at the table change, become denser, quieter, like the moment before a storm. The quartet played. Guests talked. Someone laughed at a nearby table. All of it was close by, but as if behind glass. Mark spoke, quietly and perfectly evenly. This seat is taken. Ryan got up from the chair slowly, with the kind of dignity one borrows in difficult moments when one's own has run out. He straightened his jacket and looked up at Mark, who was slightly taller. And for a fraction of a second, Alice saw in his eyes what he was probably trying to hide. Confusion. Not fear. No, Ryan Peterson wasn't afraid of men. It wasn't in his nature. But confusion, yes. The confusion of a man who had planned for one outcome and gotten another. Excuse me, he said evenly, to no one in particular, just into the air, and walked away. Mark took his seat, moved his glass, and glanced in the direction Ryan had gone, then turned his gaze to Alice. How long? He asked. How long has he been watching you? From the first minute, she said. Mark nodded, picked up the menu, opened it to the dessert page, and handed it to her. The gesture was so ordinary, so deliberately ordinary, that she laughed. Quietly, into her glass. Tiramisu, she said. Me too. George and his wife either hadn't noticed anything or pretended not to, which was perhaps even more considerate. The conversation at the table resumed its course. Alice joined in again, easily, almost immediately, like someone who has had enough difficult evenings to know how to keep a straight face. The tiramisu was brought in small glass cups, topped with a mint leaf. Alice tried it. It was good, not too sweet, with a real coffee flavor. She ate and thought, not anxiously, just about how strangely life is arranged. She hadn't planned to be here, hadn't made any plans regarding Ryan, good or bad. He had simply ceased to be a part of her world, the way a demolished building ceases to be part of a landscape. For a long time, you still look at the empty space and remember what was there. But then you get used to it, and then it's just empty, and that's normal. She thought about this and understood. Here, now, in this hall, he was trying to occupy a place in her field of vision again. Not because he was important, but because she had shown up where he hadn't expected to see her. And that in itself had proven to be unbearable for him. At a far table, Ryan sat next to Chloe. She was holding his hand, saying something animatedly, with a smile. He answered, nodded. Everything as it should be, everything correct. But Alice noticed, not because she was watching, but because it was visible that his gaze returned to her side of the room several times. Briefly, like a bird that knows its destination, but can't help but look back. The quartet changed its program again. A livelier tempo, more festive, something from a classic waltz, rearranged in a modern style. Several couples took to the dance floor. The MC announced that the next 2 numbers were for anyone who wanted to dance. "Let's go," Mark said, standing and offering his hand. She took it. They danced well together. It was obvious not only to her but to others. Not because they were trying to look good, but because when 2 people are calm and comfortable together, it creates a special harmony of movement that can't be faked. Mark led her confidently, not squeezing, not pulling, just guiding her softly and clearly, as experienced dancers do. Alice followed effortlessly. In the light of the chandeliers, the deep red dress became even more saturated, a rich, heavy color that draws the eye. Several couples glanced at them. A woman at a nearby table leaned over to her companion and said something, nodding in their direction. Alice saw it and didn't think about it. She was thinking about the music. The waltz was beautiful, the violinist played well, swaying slightly to the rhythm. And about the warmth of Mark's hand on her back, and about how, despite everything, it was a good evening. "You're looking at him," Mark said quietly. "No," she answered. "I just did. It's a reflex. I'm keeping track of where he is." "Why?" she thought. Habit. When you live with an unpredictable person for a long time, you automatically start tracking their location. It doesn't go away immediately. Mark was silent for a moment, then said, "He's been staring at you for the last 20 minutes. "I know. And how do you feel?" She answered honestly, tired of asking herself that question. "I used to ask myself that all the time. Now, I just feel normal." He nodded. They made another turn. "Normal. That's good," he said. The waltz ended. There was applause. Alice and Mark returned to the table. George poured everyone champagne and proposed a toast to beautiful couples, with a smile that held genuine warmth. His wife, Helen, as she had introduced herself at dinner, said that she and her husband had been married for 28 years. Alice replied that it was wonderful, and it was true. The evening progressed. Another course was served. A light fish dish. The MC announced more toasts. Someone said something touching about the newlyweds. Will, the groom, Alice finally got a good look at him. A big, good-natured man with an open, laughing face, clearly someone who loved company. He raised his glass and looked at Chloe with a special tenderness that couldn't be feigned. Alice watched him and thought, maybe she'll be okay. Maybe Chloe will be lucky. Maybe Ryan is different with her. She allowed herself this thought and immediately realized she didn't quite believe it. Not out of malice, but because she knew too well how the mechanism worked. People don't become different by changing partners. They become different by changing themselves. And for that, you first have to see what needs changing in yourself. Ryan had never seen that. But it wasn't her problem anymore. Mark excused himself to the bar a second time around 9:30. Someone he knew from the 90s was there. "Important conversation," he said. 20 minutes, max. "I'll order you a coffee." "Yes, please. An espresso." He left. Alice remained at the table. George and Helen had gone to dance. Nicholas Evans was on the phone by the window. Arthur had disappeared somewhere. She sat alone, watching the dance floor, holding her glass. She felt him a second before he appeared. Not a sound, not a movement, but something else. That particular thickening of the air, she had learned to recognize, like the pressure before a storm. Ryan sat down next to her. Not in Mark's chair this time, but in George's, to the side, closer. Alice didn't turn to him, continuing to watch the dance floor. "So, it's Sterling," he said quietly. There was no question in his voice, just a statement of fact. "Yes," she replied. "For how long?" "That's none of your business, Ryan." "No, I'm just curious." He smirked slightly. That same smirk she remembered, light, superior, like a man who sees confirmation of his own rightness in any answer. "You found someone quickly. I honestly didn't expect that." "What are you trying to say?" "Nothing. Just." He paused, rolling something invisible between his fingers. "You always knew how to make a good first impression." It just never lasted. Alice finally turned and looked at him calmly, directly. Did you come over here to tell me that? I came to tell you, he lowered his voice, and it took on a hard edge, that today is an important day for me. It's my wedding, and your presence here is disrespectful. Do you understand that? Disrespectful to whom? To me? To Chloe? To her family. Ryan, she said patiently. I came as Mark Sterling's guest to his partner's wedding. I didn't know it was connected to you. Now I know. But you're the one who has approached me twice now. Because you. He cut himself off. Because you can't help it. Because it got to you. That's the real reason. A pause. His face changed, becoming one she had seen rarely, but knew well. When he heard something that hit the mark and couldn't respond immediately, his face would become harder, more closed, like a door being locked from the inside. Got to me, he repeated. That's hilarious. I'm not laughing. No, you're just sitting here in your red dress. He made a dismissive gesture with his hand. Which was clearly not chosen by accident, because you always knew how to get attention when you needed it. Mark gave me this dress, she said evenly. In Milan, in March. I wore it because I like it and because it's an evening out. That's all. Of course, he said. And again, that smirk. Alice felt something. Not anger, but a kind of weariness. Not with him, but with this conversation itself, with the fact that nothing had changed in the way he spoke to her. He still took any of her answers and twisted them into whatever was convenient for him. He still turned her explanations into proof of her own guilt. It was his talent. Do you remember, he said, leaning in a little, how you cried when I left? I haven't forgotten. You said you couldn't make it on your own. Said you had no money to live on. Alice didn't answer. And now you're sitting here with Sterling, pretending everything is fine, he continued. I get it, Alice. You found a man with money, and he's pulling you along. For how long? That's the question. He'll figure out what you're really like. Ryan. Her voice was quiet, but something in it had changed. It became firmer, drier. Stop. What are you saying? Words that mean nothing anymore, not to you, not to me. I've heard them before. I know them by heart. You know how to say something cruel in a way that makes it sound like the truth. I used to believe it. Not anymore. He stared at her. Something was stirring in his eyes. Anger mixed with the confusion he was hiding behind it. So, you're the strong one now, he said with that particular intonation she hated. Great. I'm not strong or weak, she replied. I'm just here. And you're here too. And it would be nice if you went back to your wife. He didn't leave. That didn't surprise her. She knew he wouldn't leave right away. He needed the last word. He always needed the last word. Without it, he felt unfinished, like a sentence without a period. You do realize he's going to dump you, right? He said, more quietly now. Men like him don't stick around with women like you. Like what? You know what kind. No kids, no real prospects. Your agency? He shrugged slightly. Okay, a small business, fine. But Sterling needs a family, kids. He's at that age. And you? Remember what the doctor said? I remember. It was cruel. Intentionally cruel. And precisely because it touched on something she had gone through quietly, on her own, something she had never made public. The diagnosis she had received in their 3rd year of marriage, one of those that isn't a death sentence but requires time and decisions. She had tried to talk to him about it then. Seriously, to decide together. He had brushed it off. Later, not now. Later never came. She felt a sharp sting, right in the place that hadn't quite healed. She held her ground. You just said something very vile, she said quietly. You know that, right? I'm telling the truth, he replied. You never liked the truth. No, she said. You're saying what causes pain. You've confused the two. A long time ago. Ryan opened his mouth, and then something in his gaze shifted. He was looking past her, not at her. His expression changed. His mouth closed, his jaw tensed. That's not what I meant, he started, his voice a half-tone higher, somehow louder. I didn't mean you're bad. I was just saying. Are you two discussing something? A voice said over her shoulder. It was spoken evenly, without threat, without a raised tone, the way you might ask for the time. But there was something in that evenness that made Ryan fall silent mid-sentence. Alice turned. Mark was standing behind her. He was holding a small cup of espresso for her, as he'd promised, and looking at Ryan. Not coldly, not angrily, just attentively. The way a man looks when he's assessing a situation and has already made his assessment. He placed the cup in front of Alice and took his chair. Mark Sterling, he introduced himself, extending a hand to Ryan, politely, briefly. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Ryan shook his hand mechanically, the way you shake hands when the situation demands it but the desire is absent. Ryan Peterson. I know, Mark said. A pause. I heard part of your conversation, Mark said. The last part. Ryan looked at him. His eyes betrayed a quick, internal repositioning of pieces. Sterling, Will's business partner. Negotiations on a project. George Stroyer as an intermediary. The $35 million he had been thinking about for the last 2 months, for which he had taken out a loan, for which he had done all of this. The restaurant, the musicians, Chloe's dress, the honeymoon in Europe. You understand? He began, with an intonation Alice recognized instantly. The voice of a rational businessman, capable of explaining anything. This is just old history, emotions. An ex-wife, you understand, it's always. I heard enough, Mark said. 3 words, without raising his voice, without a gesture. Just 3 words, spoken in such a way that Ryan stopped mid-phrase. Alice picked up her espresso cup. The coffee was hot, good, strong, with a slight acidity. She drank and remained silent. George and I were supposed to finalize the details on the Southern project on Monday, Mark said calmly. I was going to confirm my participation. Now, I'm not so sure I'm prepared to do that. Ryan exhaled slowly. It was a visible deflation. Mr. Sterling, he said, and his voice was different now. You have to understand that these are 2 completely separate things. Business and personal life. Not for me, Mark said. They're connected. I work with people. A person's character is part of the deal. Ryan looked at him, then at Alice. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not anger, not superiority, something else. The realization that the superior position he had occupied for the last 20 minutes was an illusion. That he had been sitting here, speaking his cruel words to a woman who was with a man of a different weight than he had calculated. Alice, he said, quietly, without his usual intonation. Tell him. That it's okay. We're adults, this is old history. It's all in the past. Alice put down her cup. She looked at him, at this man she had once loved, then feared, then carried inside her like a weight, then slowly, step by step, learned to put in its place. She looked at him and thought. He's asking me to protect him now. Me, the person he threw out with a suitcase 2 years ago, saying, you were never on my level. She could have said something, smoothed it over, deflected the blow. It was an old reflex of hers, to protect him from the consequences of his own behavior, because otherwise, things would get worse. She knew that reflex by heart, knew how it worked. I can't speak for you, Ryan, she said. You chose how to behave. He looked at her for another second, then stood up. He didn't leave immediately. He stood by their table for a moment, as if searching for another argument that would change something. Then he turned and walked toward the bar. Alice watched him go, not with schadenfreude, but just watching, the way you watch something recede. Mark was silent. He didn't look at her with pity, didn't say, it's okay, didn't put his arm around her. He just sat next to her and drank his water. That was exactly the right thing to do. George returned from the dance floor with a flushed Helen, fanning herself with a program. He sat down, poured himself some water, and said something about how waltzing at his age was practically gymnastics. The conversation moved on, but Alice noticed a few guests at neighboring tables turned away a little later than necessary. Ryan's conversation with the bartender was brief. He got something strong. She saw the glass. Chloe, in her white dress, stood by the window with a friend, laughing. She clearly hadn't seen the scene. Or not all of it. Aunt Val, in her beige blazer, was staring at Alice from the opposite end of the hall. Her expression was complex, not hostile, but appraising. The way you look at someone you've underestimated. Alice looked away. Half an hour later, Ryan returned to the hall from the bar. He walked over to Chloe, said something to her. She nodded. He placed his hand on her back. A possessive, habitual, automatic gesture. Chloe tensed slightly under his hand. Or did it just seem that way to Alice? Maybe it was just an awkward position. The quartet announced a break. The MC took the microphone again, inviting guests to ask someone to dance for the next set. Doesn't matter if it's your husband, wife, or just a good person next to you. The hall laughed. Mark stood and offered Alice his hand. Again? She took his hand and rose. They went to the dance floor, along with a few other couples. The live music started again. Slower this time. Something from a jazz classic, rearranged. Mark held her a little closer than the first time. Or was she imagining it? She rested her head on his shoulder. Not for show, but because she wanted to. He said something about the kids, Mark said quietly. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Yes. That hurt. She was honest. Less than it used to. He always knew where to hit. That's his skill, but now. She paused. Now it's like an old bruise. You feel it when you touch it, but it doesn't bleed anymore. Mark didn't reply. He just squeezed her hand a little tighter. They danced in the center of the hall. And Alice closed her eyes for a few seconds. Just listening to the music, feeling his warmth, the scent of his blazer, calm and familiar. In the past 2 hours, she had done something she hadn't planned for and wasn't prepared for. She had found herself in the same space as the man who had spent 4 years methodically convincing her of her own insignificance. And she hadn't crumbled. She had held her ground. Not because she was wearing the right dress or was with the right man, but because for 2 years, she had worked on not crumbling. And it had worked. She opened her eyes. Chloe was standing at the edge of the dance floor with a glass of water in her hand, watching them. Not with hostility, but with confusion. The way a person looks when they've just seen something that doesn't fit their familiar picture of the world. Ryan was not beside her. He was standing by the opposite wall, talking to some man, intensely, with pressure. Too animatedly for a casual conversation. Alice and Chloe's eyes met for a second. Alice didn't smile. Not out of hostility, but because any smile here would have been wrong. She just looked. After a second, Chloe looked away. The dance ended. Applause. They returned to the table, and Alice had just sat down when she felt that something in the hall had changed. Not the sound, not the movement, but the general temperature. Several nearby guests glanced toward the buffet table. The MC fell silent mid-sentence and looked there too. Ryan was standing in the middle of the hall. He was walking toward them. Not stealthily, like the first 2 times, but directly, quickly, with that look Alice knew as the mode when he no longer cared what anyone else thought. It was a bad sign. In these moments, he said things he couldn't take back later, and didn't try to. Mark noticed it before she did. He didn't stand, didn't change his posture, just turned slightly, calmly, the way you turn when you hear your name. Ryan stopped next to their table. Several guests turned to look. Openly now. Aunt Val half rose in her chair. So, Sterling decides who to work with based on what his girlfriend has told him? Ryan said. His voice was even, but too even, the kind of evenness that takes effort to maintain. Is that what you call professionalism? Mark looked at him. I heard enough with my own ears, he said. You heard a private conversation between me and my ex-wife, who is sitting at your table. She came here on purpose. You understand that, right? She can't let go. She's always been like this. She? Ryan. Alice said his name quietly, but something in her tone made him stop. You're making a scene at your own wedding? He looked at her, then around the room. The guests were watching. The quartet had faded out, gradually, but they were silent. The hall had grown quiet. Chloe stood by the wall, staring at her husband. The glass in her hand was trembling. Did you come here to ruin my life? He said quietly. No longer for the hall, just for her. Did you plan this? No, she replied. You did this yourself. Right here, right now. All by yourself. For a few seconds, he stood there, glaring at her, then shifted his gaze to Mark, and something in his face. It didn't break. No. That would have required admitting defeat, and Ryan Peterson didn't know how to admit defeat. Something in him just went out. Briefly, but noticeably. He turned and walked toward the exit of the hall. The quartet, after a 10-second pause, quietly resumed playing. A few nearby guests exchanged glances. Aunt Val sank back into her chair. At the next table, someone whispered to their neighbor, "Who was that?" And the neighbor answered something quietly, with a knowing look. Alice picked up her espresso, now almost cold, and drank it to the bottom. Mark was looking straight ahead. George is calling, he said, not looking at his phone. He saw all of that. And what will you tell him? Mark looked at her. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a calm, slightly weary resolve. The truth, he said. George called back 3 minutes after Ryan disappeared through the door. Mark answered, said briefly. Yes, I saw. We'll talk later, and put his phone away. He stood up, adjusting his jacket. I want to talk to him, he said to Alice. Not asking for permission, just informing her. Why? She asked. Because this conversation needs to be finished. Properly or definitively. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know. He briefly touched her hand. I'll be right back. She was about to say she would go with him, but she didn't. Not because he wouldn't want her to, but because she understood this was his conversation. He was going there not because of her, or not only because of her. He was going because he didn't know how to leave things unfinished that required finishing. It was in his nature. Alice stayed at the table. Helen subtly moved closer, without asking questions, and began talking about the appetizers, about how the salmon was particularly good tonight. Alice nodded. Out of the corner of her eye, she watched as Mark crossed the hall and went out into the foyer, where Ryan had gone. Ryan was standing in the foyer by the window. He had already composed himself, externally. His jacket was buttoned, his posture straight, his face a mask. But his right hand was gripping his phone too tightly, his knuckles white. When Mark entered, he looked up. "Mr. Sterling," he began immediately. His voice was even, businesslike. He had switched to negotiator mode. Alice would guess this later, when Mark told her about it. "I understand that what happened in there looked unprofessional. It was personal. It's been building up for a long time. And today, the circumstances." "Ryan," Mark said. He stopped. "I didn't come here for an explanation." A pause. "Then why?" "I came to tell you personally, without intermediaries, that on Monday, I will ask George to postpone our meeting on the Southern project." Ryan exhaled slowly. It was the kind of exhale that comes when you grasp the scale of a loss in a single second. "Do you understand what this means for me?" he asked quietly. "I can imagine." "No, you can't." Something else entered his voice. Not anger now, something closer to desperation, though he was clearly fighting it. "I took out a loan 3 months ago against this contract, against your entry into the project. George's partner was waiting for your decision as the final green light. We were already drawing up the budget for the first phase." "Those were your business decisions," Mark said. "I didn't make them. But the negotiations were happening. Everything was moving toward an agreement. And now, because of the way I saw you speak to the woman at my table," Mark interjected. Quietly. Without pressure. "It's not just that, of course. I've seen enough since the moment we walked into this hall. The way you approached her, what you said. That was a private conversation. You raised your voice." You talked about kids," Mark said. "About her diagnosis. Publicly. That's not a business miscalculation or an emotional outburst. That's character." Ryan was silent. The foyer was quiet. From the hall came the muffled hum of voices. Someone was laughing. The quartet was playing again. Life beyond the door was going on, as usual. A celebration, a wedding, the first day of a new marriage. "I didn't say anything she didn't already know herself," Ryan said after a pause. Quietly, almost without inflection. "That is the worst possible argument," Mark replied. "You realize that, don't you?" Ryan was silent again. Mark looked at him without anger, without triumph. "Just looking, the way you look at a fact that is unpleasant but undeniable." "I need your help," Ryan said finally. It took effort. It was audible. "I'm asking you to talk to George, to tell him it was personal, that it won't affect the work. I'm asking you not to make a decision today." "My head is clear on this," Mark said. "Then for the sake of the deal, for the sake of the project. You know the Southern project is a good entry point, that there. I understand. But I don't work with people who behave the way you did today. It's a matter of principle. Not because of her, because of me. I choose who I do business with." "Because of her," Ryan said. And this time, there was something completely different in his voice, bitter, dark. "You do realize she's using you, that she—" "Stop," Mark said. Without irritation, just a full stop. Ryan stopped. "I'll tell you one thing," Mark said, "and we won't return to this. In the past few years, Alice has built an agency from scratch, won several competitive bids without anyone's help, manages a team, and knows her business better than most people I've worked with. I have no idea what you told her during your marriage, but what I heard today wasn't about her. It was about you." Ryan looked at him for a long time, then lowered his gaze. "So it's final," he said. "Yes. 35 million. You'll find another investor." "Not in this time frame." Mark didn't reply. It wasn't his problem, and they both knew it. Ryan stood by the window, motionless, the way people stand after receiving a blow and haven't yet decided what to do about it. Then he took out his phone, started dialing a number, and stopped. "Is George here?" he asked. "In the hall," Mark said. "I need to talk to him." Ryan straightened up, and something switched on in him again. Businesslike, composed, the person he knew how to be when the stakes were high. "He might convince you to reconsider." He knows the project details better than anyone. It's a profitable deal for all parties. And if you just talk calmly, without emotions. Ryan, Mark said. I've already made my decision. But you're a businessman. You understand that one evening isn't a basis for. A person's character is a basis. A pause. Ryan looked at him, and his expression showed a frantic, rapid calculation. He was trying to find an angle, an entry point, a way to turn the conversation around. Alice, later, when Mark told her about it, recognized the mechanism. It was exactly what he used to do with her. Always looking for the right angle. Let me talk to Alice, Ryan said finally. Quietly, one-on-one. Without you. Mark paused. That's her decision. Then ask her. Tell her I'm asking for 5 minutes. Mark looked at him for a few more seconds, then gave a short nod, without words, and went back into the hall. Alice listened to this silently. Mark said briefly, he's asking for 5 minutes to talk to you. Alone. I'm not advising for or against it. She looked up at him. He was watching her evenly, without pressure, without a hint, just stating a fact and leaving the choice to her. She thought for about 10 seconds. Okay, she said. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked out into the foyer. Ryan was at the window. When she appeared, he straightened up again, that reflex to maintain posture, to keep up appearances. She stopped a few feet away from him, not too close. Alice, he began. And his voice was different, a tone she had rarely heard, without superiority, without irony, just tired. I'm asking you, tell him it's okay. That it was personal, that it has nothing to do with work. He respects you, he'll listen to you. One word from you, and that's it. She looked at him. Do you understand what you're asking? She said quietly. I'm asking for a favor. We're adults. Whatever happened, happened a long time ago. Right now, I'm just asking. Ryan. She stopped him, not by raising her voice, but with that specific intonation she had learned to use in the last 2 years. Firm, calm, leaving no room for negotiation. Do you remember what you said to me when I was leaving? He was silent. You said I was never on your level. That you had put up with it for too long. A pause. Those were your last words to me in that apartment. You gave me 2 days to pack and went to watch football. Alice, I'm not saying this to blame you. I'm saying it so you understand. You are asking for help from a person you made it clear was worthless. And this is important, I don't believe that anymore. And that is exactly why I will not do what you're asking. Ryan stared at her for a long time. Something complex was happening in his face, several layers at once. The anger he was suppressing, the confusion he hadn't expected to feel, and something else, something like a delayed recognition, as if he were seeing the real, present-day her for the first time. I can't speak for you, Ryan, she said. You chose how to behave. Now, and then. She turned and started walking toward the door to the hall. Alice, he said from behind her. She stopped but didn't turn around. He didn't finish. A pause. Never mind, go. She entered the hall. Mark was standing by their table, talking to Arthur. He wasn't looking toward the door, not waiting for her demonstratively, just talking. When she approached, he gave her a brief, questioning look. Without words. It's done, she said. We can go. Mark turned and walked back to the door of the hall. He had his hand on the handle when he heard, from the depths of the foyer, a quiet voice, almost to himself. Tell her that Ryan didn't finish. He waved his hand. Never mind. It doesn't matter. Mark looked at him for a few seconds. Tell her yourself, he replied, if you can find the words. And he entered the hall. He didn't tell Alice everything right away, just a brief. We talked. I said everything. She nodded and didn't ask for details. She could see his face, composed, without triumph, and understood there was nothing that needed to be reported right now. At the table, George looked at Mark questioningly. He gave a short shake of his head. George sighed, not with surprise, but the way you sigh when the expected finally happens. A shame, he said quietly. It was a good project. We'll find another, Mark replied. At their table, the conversation returned to normal. Arthur was talking about a new project in Silicon Alley. Helen asked the waiter for more tea. The evening went on. Alice sat and watched the dance floor. A few couples were twirling, not young, dressed up, clearly enjoying the evening. The quartet was playing something lyrical, almost tender. The crystal pendants on the chandelier swayed slightly in the air, scattering small, rainbow-colored spots on the tablecloths. She thought, this is strange. She had come to a stranger's wedding, found herself at her ex-husband's family wedding, survived 2 unpleasant conversations and 1 public scene, and now she was sitting at a table, drinking tea, and watching people dance. And inside, there was no rage, no bitterness, no schadenfreude. Something else, something quiet, almost neutral, like the air after a storm. She saw Chloe by chance. She was standing by a tall window at the far end of the hall, alone, without her husband, without her friends. She was holding a glass of water, almost empty, but she wasn't drinking, just holding it. In the dim light, the white dress, with its crystals, looked different than it had under the bright lights of the ceremony. Not festive, but almost fragile. The train was slightly crumpled on one side. The veil was gone, probably lying on the back of a chair somewhere. Chloe was staring out the window. Alice didn't know if she had seen the whole conversation in the foyer, or only part of it. Probably part. But even a part, judging by her posture, had said enough. Her shoulders were slumped, her head slightly bowed, like someone thinking about something heavy right in the middle of a party. Alice watched her for a few seconds. She remembered herself. Not at her own wedding. No, everything was still bright then. She remembered herself later, in the 3rd year. When she already knew how it worked but still couldn't leave. Because gradually, step by step, she had been convinced. There was nowhere to go, and nothing to go with. She remembered that feeling, of standing in the middle of your life and not understanding at what point it had become someone else's. Chloe was 26. Her life was just beginning. Alice didn't get up and go to her. It wouldn't have been right. Not her place, not her conversation, not her right. Everyone has to find their own way. That was the one thing she knew for sure. But she looked at this young woman in her slightly crumpled wedding dress by the dark window and felt something that was neither schadenfreude nor sympathy. Just a quiet, tired understanding. Mark suggested they leave around 11. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. "I'm fine to, if you." "No," she said. "I'm ready to go." They said goodbye to George and Helen, to Arthur, to Nicholas Evans, and approached the bride and groom's table to offer their final congratulations. It was a rule of etiquette that Mark always observed. Will hugged Mark, said something about being glad to see him. Chloe smiled, a little mechanically, but still. She looked at Alice, briefly, directly. There was something hard to name in her eyes, a mix of curiosity, caution, and something like an unasked question. Alice said, "Congratulations," simply, without flourish. Chloe nodded. Ryan wasn't at the table. He appeared a minute after they walked away. He came through a side door, back in his tuxedo, back to standing straight. Alice saw him from behind. He went to Chloe, whispered something in her ear. She didn't turn to him right away. The pause between them was a second longer than it usually is between people who are happy. The coat check was empty. The party was still going. They were among the first to leave. Alice put on her coat, adjusted her scarf. Mark waited beside her. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not doing more for me than you needed to." He looked at her, a little surprised, but understanding. "You handled it yourself." "I know, but you didn't get in the way." It sounded strange, she knew. But that was what was important. That was what distinguished him from the men who, seeing a woman handling a situation, start to insert themselves, to take over, to solve, to interfere too soon. Mark didn't do that. He was present, steadily, but he didn't overshadow. That required a special kind of confidence, one that doesn't need to be demonstrated. They went outside. The autumn air, after the warmth of the restaurant, hit her face. Cold, damp, smelling of fallen leaves and wet asphalt. The sky over New York was a dark orange from the city lights, starless, but not oppressive, just familiar. Alice stopped on the steps and took a deep breath. "This is nice," she said out loud. To no one, to the air. Mark stood beside her, buttoning his coat. "What's nice?" "The air, a pause, and the fact that we're leaving." They descended the steps and walked to the car. Alice walked beside him in her deep red dress under her unbuttoned coat, in high heels on the wet autumn tiles of a New York side street. No rush, no heaviness. Just walking. In the car, she was silent for the first few minutes, looking out the window. Lights, trees, late-night pedestrians. New York at 11 p.m. was unhurried, almost meditative. "Do you want to talk about it?" Mark asked. He wasn't looking at her, keeping his eyes on the road. That was right. "Not right now," she said. "Okay." They drove in silence for a few more minutes. Then she started talking anyway. Not because she had decided to, it just came out. "I was thinking today about how he could be," she said, "when he wanted to. At the wedding, at the beginning of the evening, he looked at her so genuinely. Did you see? I saw. It's not an act. He can feel that way. It's real. It's just not constant. It switches on when it's needed, and then it switches off. And you're left alone in the dark, thinking you're the one to blame that the light went out. Mark was silent. For 2 years, I thought it was my problem. That I wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't talking right, wasn't looking right, wasn't doing the right thing. He was very good at explaining to me what I was doing wrong. Always logically, calmly, with arguments. That's why it was so hard. Because he didn't yell. That's worse than yelling, Mark said. Yes. She looked at the lights outside. Because when they yell, at least you know something is wrong. But when it's quiet, you start to think you're the one who's wrong. He didn't reply, didn't offer words of comfort, didn't say, it's all in the past, or, you did great. He just drove beside her and listened. That, too, was right. Today, she continued after a minute, when he came over the first time and started talking, I felt it again. That familiar reaction to shrink, to explain, to justify. It's still there. A reflex. A pause. But I noticed it. And that's different. Before, I wouldn't have noticed. I would have just done it. That's a big difference, Mark said. Huge. They stopped at a red light. The light reflected in a puddle on the asphalt, blurring and trembling. Alice looked at the reflection and thought, this is what it looks like. Light refracted through water, recognizable but not direct. Not the same as it was. The light turned green. They drove on. He said something about the kids, she said. You heard? Yes. That was a low blow. He knew it was a low blow. He always knew where to hit. She paused. But you know what's strange? Before, that would have ruined my whole evening, maybe for days. Now, a sting, and that's it. A sting remained, not devastation. Because you're no longer building your self-image on him, Mark said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Exactly. He drove her to her building. They stood by the car for a moment. She wasn't in a hurry to go inside. He wasn't in a hurry to leave. It was a hard night for you, he said. Not a question. It was, varied, she answered honestly. There were moments, yes. But overall, she searched for the word. More, important. Not hard, but important. As if something ended. Not because of tonight, it ended before. Tonight, I just saw it. He nodded. When I was talking to him in the foyer, Mark said, he asked me to tell you something. What? He didn't finish. Said it wasn't important. Alice was quiet for a second, then nodded. It really isn't. Mark smiled slightly. The kind of smile she loved most. No pretense, no effort, just because. Go home, he said. I'll call you in the morning. Okay. She had her hand on the door handle when he said, Alice. She turned. I'm glad we went, he said, despite everything. She looked at him. The streetlight above the entrance illuminated him from the side. A dark silhouette, a calm face. Behind him, a New York courtyard, late autumn, wet leaves on the ground. Me too, she said, and went inside. At home, she didn't go straight to bed. She took off her shoes at the door, placed them neatly on the rack, hung up her coat, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it standing by the sink. Then she went to her room, turned on a floor lamp, its light soft and warm, and sat in an armchair. Just sat. She thought about Chloe by the dark window, about how she held her glass, about what a person looks like when they've just received the first hint that the world isn't structured the way they've been told. Alice didn't know what would happen to Chloe, whether she would leave or stay, convince herself it was a one-time thing, that it was just a bad day, that he would never be like that again. Or whether she would see, understand, and leave while it was still early. It wasn't her choice, not her story. Alice's story was right here, in this room, in this armchair, in this warm light. The agency she was building, brick by brick. The team that believed in what they were doing. The man who had just stood outside her building and said, I'm glad. No explanations, no extra words. She hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't gone there to prove anything or to punish anyone. Life itself had brought her there, by chance, absurdly, as life does. And it turned out that she was standing firm, that she hadn't been shaken, that the past, over there behind the glass, no longer held the power over her that it had 2 years ago. It wasn't a victory. It was something quieter and more important than a victory. The lamp glowed softly. Outside the window, the park was rustling. The wind in the remaining leaves on the branches, quiet, almost soothing. Alice sat in the armchair, staring into space, and felt something in her chest slowly release. Something she had been carrying for a long time. Not just from tonight, but for much longer. And now, she had set it down. Her phone on the side table lit up with an incoming message. She looked. Jessica. You were online around midnight? Worried. Alice smiled and typed back. Everything's fine. I'll tell you tomorrow. She thought for a second and added, seriously. It's fine. She put the phone down. Then, silence. A long, soft silence. The night, and the lamp, and the wind in the park, and that strange, almost unfamiliar feeling of being where you are, and knowing it's the right place. She fell asleep in the armchair, not rare shone. Heow, shown. In the morning, she woke up in the armchair with a stiff neck and a feeling that was hard to describe at first. Then she understood, lightness. Not a joyful, euphoric lightness, just lightness. The way you feel after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally putting it down. The body remembers the weight, but the hands are already free. Outside, a gray Sunday dawn was breaking. The leaves on the birch tree in the courtyard were almost all gone, only a few stubborn ones clinging to the branches. Alice watched them for a few more minutes without moving. Then she got up and put the kettle on. Mark called at 10:30, as he'd promised. How are you? He asked. Slept in a chair, she said. My neck hurts. That's not an answer to my question. Good, she said. Honestly, good. He was quiet for a second. I was thinking about you this morning. And yesterday, you were very. He searched for the word. Composed. That's not the word I wanted to say. Whole. That's the word. She held her cup with both hands, hot, almost scalding, and looked out the window at the gray sky. I like that word, she said. Me too. They talked for a little longer. About nothing in particular, the way people who are good together talk on a Sunday morning. About tea, about the weather, about a meeting he had in the afternoon that wasn't mandatory. Then she said she wanted to go for a walk. He said he'd see her tomorrow. She put her phone away and got dressed. Ryan did not sleep that Sunday morning. He hadn't slept since 3 a.m. Lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the new bedroom he and Chloe had moved into before the wedding, planning to renovate. The apartment was good, spacious, in a nice neighborhood, bought with a mortgage and a down payment he had planned to pay off with the advance from the Southern project. Now, at 4 a.m, that calculation weighed like a stone. $35 million wasn't just a large sum. It was the fulcrum around which everything else was built, the loan for the wedding. He had taken it out from the bank over the summer, confident the Southern project would cover everything in the first quarter. The restaurant for 120 people, the live music, the destination photographer, Chloe's custom-made dress. Not the one she wanted. He had insisted on something beautiful, top of the line, because Chloe's father, Andrew Zimmerman, had to see that his son-in-law didn't skimp. The honeymoon in Europe. Tickets already bought, hotels booked. He lay there and counted. In his head, without paper, because on paper it would look even worse. Beside him, Chloe was sleeping on her side of the bed, turned slightly away. She had gone to bed in silence. Back at the restaurant, she had stopped really talking. She answered guests' questions, smiled, did everything right, but with Ryan, she spoke only when necessary. In the car on the way home, she sat staring out the window. He hadn't asked, and she hadn't started. The silence was worse than a fight. Ryan turned onto his other side, closed his eyes, and lay there. At 4:30, he got up, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and looked out at the dark courtyard. Streetlights, an empty parking lot, a single late-night cat on a curb. He knew that Sterling. Mark Sterling. He knew the name well. Everyone in their field knew it. Sterling Properties was a serious company. An impeccable reputation. Sterling himself was known for not having the same conversation twice. A decision was made, and that was it. Ryan had heard that from George at the beginning of their negotiations. Working with him is gold, but if something goes wrong, don't even call. At the time, he thought it was about business disagreements. It turned out to be about this, too. He picked up his phone and texted George. Call me in the morning. Urgent. He sent it. Then he stared at the screen for another minute. No reply, of course. It was 4 a.m. He put his phone down and went back to the bedroom. Chloe was lying on her back now, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't asleep. Who is Alice? She asked. Quietly, without aggression. My ex-wife. I gathered that. A pause. Why did you talk to her like that? It's complicated. Try me. He paused, then sat on the edge of the bed with his back to her. We had a difficult marriage. She knows how to get under my skin, even after 2 years. It's irrational, I know. You talked about kids, Chloe said. I heard part of it. You said something about kids and a diagnosis. Ryan didn't answer. Is it true? Chloe asked. You said that to her in front of people? Chloe, is it true or not? Yes, he said after a pause. It wasn't the best thing I could have said. I was angry. A long silence. You were angry, she repeated. Not judgingly, just repeating something that needed to be heard again to be understood. And so you said that to a woman, about her diagnosis, in public. Chloe, that's in the past, between us. Do you get that angry with me sometimes? She asked. Just as quietly. When you're angry, do you also know where to hit? Ryan turned to her. In the dim light of the bedroom, he couldn't make out the details of her face. Just the outline, her gaze. That's different, he said. How would I know? She said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a real question. And that made it heavier than any accusation. Ryan didn't answer. Chloe turned back to the wall. They lay side by side in the dark, the physical distance between them small, maybe 2 feet, but it felt like something else, like a border that had just been drawn. George Stroyer called at 9:30 in the morning. Ryan answered on the first ring. I'll contact Sterling myself, he said immediately. Today. I'll explain the situation, I'll ask. Ryan, George said. His voice was tired and without preamble. I already spoke with him this morning. And? A pause. He said. Find another investor. Ryan stood by the kitchen window. The courtyard below, the same streetlights, now off. A gray morning, wet benches. He might change his mind, Ryan said. He won't, George said. You know how he works. I know. It's a closed issue. George, I need to explain to you. Ryan. There was something in his voice that made you want to stop talking. I saw everything yesterday. I was sitting at the same table. I understand that it's personal. That ex-wives are a whole other story, that everyone has their moments. But you? A short pause, you let Sterling see it. In front of his partner, at his table, at a stranger's wedding. That's not personal. That's called judgment. I'm prepared to compensate financially. That won't compensate for it. Silence. What about the project? Ryan asked quietly. We're looking for other financing. The timeline is shifting. The first phase is in question. In question. That means? It means I don't know. Not yet. A pause. Ryan, you and I have a good relationship. I value what we've done together. But on this project, I can't promise you anything right now. The line went dead. Ryan put down his phone, placed his cup on the table, dropped it, and it clinked against the tabletop louder than it should have. He stood there, looking at the table, at the white tablecloth Chloe had laid out before the wedding, at the trivet in the shape of a little house that Chloe had bought at a market, because she liked it. At the gray morning window. $35 million. The wedding loan, $28,000 at 18% interest for 12 months. The mortgage on the apartment, a monthly payment he had planned to cover with the advance. The car lease, another payment. The renovations in the apartment. The estimate was already approved. The crew was supposed to start in November. All of it was hanging in the air now. Not on a contract that had fallen apart, but just there, without support. He sat down at the table and buried his head in his hands. Chloe went to her parents in the afternoon. She said she had promised to help her mother with something around the house. Ryan didn't ask questions. She left without a long goodbye, just took her bag, said, I'll be back tonight, and closed the door. He was left alone in the new apartment, which still smelled of the previous tenant's paint and where there was only as much furniture as they had managed to bring in before the wedding. He sat in the only armchair in the living room, a corner leather one bought on credit 3 weeks ago, and stared at the empty wall where a painting was supposed to hang. They hadn't chosen a painting yet. He thought about Sterling. Not about the money, but about the conversation itself, about how he had stood there in the hall, looking at him without yelling, without threats, without theatrics, just looking. And in that calmness was something Ryan couldn't name but felt keenly. A man who didn't need to prove his own weight. Ryan knew how to make an impression. He knew that. He knew how to enter a room and be noticed. He knew how to talk to the right people, how to persuade. These were real skills, honed over years. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt that somewhere in that toolkit, there was a void. A place where something else should be, and it wasn't there. He thought about Alice, about how she had stood in the foyer, calm, without trembling, without trying to soften the blow. You are asking for help from a person you made it clear was worthless. It was said without malice. And that was precisely why it hit its mark more accurately than if it had been. He hadn't expected that from her. No, he had expected something else. He had expected the Alice he knew, cautious, prone to smoothing things over, good at convincing herself it was better to stay quiet. The one who for 3 years had listened to his interpretations of reality and started to believe them. This woman in the red dress was different. He didn't know if it angered him or not. It was mostly unfamiliar. As unfamiliar as when a space you're used to suddenly changes, and you don't know where to stand. Chloe came back in the evening, earlier than he expected, around 8. She went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, without saying anything. Ryan got up from his chair, and went to her. "How's your mom?" "Fine." She stood by the stove, watching the kettle. Her back was straight, her hands clasped on the edge of the counter. He looked at her, at that straight back, at those clenched fingers, and knew a conversation was coming. "Chloe," he said. "I was talking to my mom," she said, not turning around. "Not about yesterday, just talking. And she asked if everything was okay with us." A pause. "I said yes." He waited. "That was a lie," she added quietly. "Chloe." "Ryan, I saw how you talked to her. Not just at the end, in front of everyone. I saw you before, when you went to her table. I was standing by the window and I saw you from across the hall. You went up to her 3 times. 3. He was silent. "You talked about a diagnosis. You said something about kids." Her voice didn't tremble. She spoke evenly, almost methodically, the way people speak when they've decided in advance not to cry. "This is a woman you lived with for 4 years. Your ex-wife. And you said that to her. Not in a fight, not in a fit of rage. You went to her specifically. 3 times. What was that?" She finally turned. "What was that?" There was no fury in her eyes. It was worse than fury. There was something attentive, the expression people have when they are trying to understand something important about a person they thought they knew. "It was anger," he said. "I was angry that she was there. It was unexpected, and I." "You were angry," she repeated, an echo, almost the same as the night before. "And so you said those things?" "Yes. So, when you're angry?" "Chloe, that's different." "No," she said. Quietly, but with such firmness that he fell silent. "You can't just say that's different every time. It's not different. It's you. It's how you react when things don't go your way. It's what you do to people who make you angry." A pause. "She didn't do anything wrong to you yesterday. She was just there." Ryan stood in the kitchen doorway, and was silent. He could have started explaining what his marriage to Alice had been like, what led to the divorce, what had built up. He knew how to explain, how to construct a logic that sounded convincing. But now, looking at Chloe, at her straight back, and that attentive, almost weary gaze, he understood that explanations wouldn't land where they needed to. Because she wasn't asking about Alice. She was asking about him. "I need to think," Chloe said. "Just give me a few days." "What does think mean?" "Think means think," she repeated. "I don't know yet. I need time." The kettle boiled. She poured hot water into a mug, took it, and went to the bedroom. The door closed. It didn't slam, just closed. Ryan was left standing in the kitchen. Alice walked for a long time that Sunday. She put on old sneakers and a jacket, took her phone, and went through the park. Not fast, without a destination, just walking. Autumn in Yorkville on a day like this was special. The leaves lay in a thick carpet on the paths, yellow and orange, some already matted to the ground by rain and darkened. The air was cold, with a hint of pine from the trees along the fence. A few passers-by, a couple with a stroller, an elderly man with a dog, 2 runners. She thought about the night before. Not the whole thing, but in flashes. Chloe at the window. Aunt Val with her handkerchief. Ryan in the foyer with his white-knuckled grip on his phone. Mark's voice in the car. "Because you're no longer building your self-image on him." She thought about it and knew it was true. Exactly that. For a long time, the whole time they were married and for a long time after, she had looked at herself through his eyes, evaluated herself through his reactions. Succeeded, he was pleased. Failed, he was right. It was his system, and she had integrated herself into it so deeply that she had stopped noticing. Getting out of someone else's coordinate system, it turns out, is work. Long, slow work, invisible from the outside. Alice reached the end of the park, stood at the exit for a moment, then turned back. She thought about her agency, about the Monday meeting, about the new bid her writer, Kevin, had sent her on Friday, before she left for the evening. A big client, a serious scope, good money. She needed to review the materials Monday morning before the team meeting. She thought about it and felt what she now knew well. A quiet, steady pleasure from work that was hers. No one could take that away from her, not then, not now. Monday started early. Alice arrived at the office by 9, when the others were just starting to come in. She made coffee, opened her laptop, read her emails from the weekend. The bid materials from Kevin. A large document, a 40-page technical specification. She scanned it, made notes, built a structure in her head. By 10, when the team arrived, she had a draft of the presentation. The meeting was lively. Kevin, Sophie, and Megan, all three had read the specs over the weekend and came with ideas. Alice listened, clarified, sometimes interjected, not to stop them but to guide. That was something else she had learned. To hear a good idea in its raw form and help it become precise. Sophie said at one point, "Alice, what if we try telling real stories, not selling a product, but selling the people behind it?" Alice looked at her. "That's right," she said. "We'll go in that direction." Sophie nodded, pleased, with the expression of someone who has been heard. Alice noticed it and thought, that's what's important. That, and how a person leaves a meeting feeling that their idea was needed. George called her on Tuesday morning. She took the call. He said briefly that he wanted to discuss a possible collaboration, that Mark had given her a strong recommendation, and that his new project needed professional content support. "It's an open bid," he added. "You'll have competitors, but I wanted to speak with you personally." "Send me the technical specifications," Alice said. "I'll review them and give you an answer by the end of the week." "Excellent." She put her phone down and returned to the document on her screen. She thought for a second, not about the call, but about the fact that Mark had given her contact information to George. He hadn't said a word to her, just did it. Not help in the form of a solved problem, but an opportunity that she could use or not. The difference was significant. She smiled briefly to herself and typed the next paragraph. Ryan sold his car on Thursday. Not because there were no other options, there were. But it was the fastest way to cover some of the immediate payments while he figured out how to refinance his loan. The car was a good one, a 3-year-old German sedan, well maintained. A buyer found him through an app the same day. Ryan handed over the keys in a mall parking lot, shook a stranger's hand, got on the subway, and went home. He hadn't been on the subway in 7 years. He sat in the car, looking at the people across from him. Tired faces, phones, someone's headphones. The car swayed at the joints. Tunnel lights flashed by the window. He thought about how he would explain the car to Chloe. She didn't know everything yet. She knew the deal had fallen through, knew there were financial difficulties, but she didn't know the details. He hadn't told her. That, too, was a reflex of his. Not to include, not to share, to maintain control of the information. Chloe was there these days, but as if behind glass. She came home on time, cooked, cleaned, spoke when necessary. In the mornings, she went to her parents, in the evenings, she returned. I need to think, hung in the apartment like an open window. It was cold, and you couldn't get rid of it until you closed it. When he told her about the car that evening, just briefly, without explaining about the Southern project, she was silent for a second, then said, "I thought your business was doing well. Temporary difficulties." Temporary. She said the word the same way she had been saying others lately, methodically, like something that needed to be verified. "Ryan, I want to know the truth. All of it." He looked at her. "It's complicated." "Then let's try," she said. "We have time." Alice found out about the car by chance, not from a mutual acquaintance, but just by seeing the listing on an app. She was looking for something else entirely, comparing prices for a small office rental for her team, which had grown to 5 people and no longer fit in their old space. And in the recommended listings, the make and model year flashed by. Something familiar about the description. The color, the features. She clicked, looked at the photos. Yes, it was his car. She remembered that scratch on the left fender from back then. The listing had been posted 3 days ago. Status: sold. Alice closed the tab and opened the next one with office listings. She didn't feel anything sharp. Not Schadenfreude. Not sympathy, not even interest. Just a fact. Another fact from someone else's life, which was now truly someone else's. She selected 3 office options to view next week and wrote to Kevin to coordinate a time. On Friday evening, Mark came over. He brought food from a small restaurant nearby that they both liked. Pasta, salmon, something with mushrooms in a small pot. They ate in the kitchen, without setting a formal table. Just put down the containers, got out plates, and sat across from each other. Alice told him about the bid for George's project. "Are you going to participate?" Mark asked. "I am. I'll look at their specs. The team will put together a good proposal. If we win, great. If not, it wasn't ours this time." "Reasonable. It's an open bid," she added. He said himself there would be competitors. "I don't want to take anything from anyone that I haven't earned." Mark looked at her with an expression she now recognized. Something warm, a little thoughtful. "I know," he said. "That's why I gave him your contact information." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, it was getting dark. Early autumn twilight, almost black by 5. The streetlight in the courtyard came on and was reflected in the window. "Have you thought about that night?" she asked. "Sometimes. And I thought about what you said to him in the foyer," he said. "When he asked you to step in for him. What did you think?" "That it wasn't easy to say." A pause. "Because it meant not letting him get away with it. And you were used to softening things." "I was," she agreed. "I used to be. Now." She looked at him, at this face she had learned to read over the past few months. Not completely. He was a complex man, private about some things, but honest. Always honest. "Not anymore," she said. "I've stopped softening things for him. Maybe I should have a long time ago." Mark nodded. "I'm glad you didn't leave then," he said. "When we first walked in." "Me too," she replied. "Although for the first few minutes, I really wanted to." "I saw that. And I waited," he said simply. "I wanted to see what you would choose." She paused. "And what were you thinking while you waited?" Mark smiled slightly. "That you would stay." She picked up her fork and finished her pasta. Chloe left 3.5 weeks after the wedding. Not on the night of the fight, not the next morning. She was the kind of person who doesn't act in the heat of the moment. She took her time, as she had asked. For a few days, she walked around the apartment, looked at him, talked. Not about that night anymore, just about everyday things, about work, about needing to buy curtains for the kitchen. At first, Ryan took it as a sign of reconciliation. Then he realized. No, she was just watching. Studying what she hadn't had time to study before. At the end of the 3rd week, she came home with a small duffel bag and said she was going to stay with her parents for a while. "I need to figure things out," she said. She wasn't crying. She stood in the hallway in her coat, with her bag, and looked at him calmly, with that same attentive gaze she had had since that night, a gaze Ryan had never learned to endure. "What do you need to figure out?" he asked. "Whether I want to live like this," she replied. "What does like this mean?" "When you're angry, you know where to hit. I don't want to one day become the person whose weak spots you know how to hit." He couldn't find an answer. She nodded, as if his silence was enough, and left. Ryan remained in the hallway, staring at the closed door. Then he went into the living room, sat in the leather armchair bought on credit, not yet fully paid for, and sat in the silence for a long time. He thought about what he would say to her father, Andrew Zimmerman. A client, an old acquaintance. His daughter had left 3 weeks after the wedding. It was a conversation he couldn't avoid. Ryan could already see it. Zimmerman would be calm, no drama, but his eyes would say everything. And then, he would probably recommend a different contractor to his next client. Or not recommend anyone at all. The chain of consequences was unwinding on its own, link by link. George called at the end of that week, briefly, all business. He said he had decided to split the project. The part Ryan had been leading would go to another partner. No hard feelings. "It's just logistics," he added. Ryan understood it wasn't logistics. He found a lawyer, a good, expensive one who charged by the hour. The lawyer looked at the documents and said the loan agreements were drafted correctly, there were no violations, he would have to pay on schedule. Refinancing was possible, but interest rates were high now, they would have to run the numbers. Ryan sat in an office with expensive furniture and listened to a man explain his own situation to him. The apartment on the Upper West Side, the one he had thrown Alice out of with 2 suitcases, was in his name. The mortgage was almost paid off, only a year left. He didn't start thinking about it right away, but the thought appeared and wouldn't leave. Sell it, pay off the loans, take the remainder, and start over from a different point. It was humiliating, but the numbers spoke for themselves. In mid-November, he posted the listing. Showings started immediately. It was a good apartment, a decent neighborhood. The first potential buyers came on the weekend. Ryan opened the door, showed them the rooms, stated the price. The apartment is in good condition, high ceilings, a view of the park. The visitors nodded, looked around, left. He would close the door and sit by the window in the empty living room. He had removed all traces of Alice from this apartment in the first few days after she left, rearranged the furniture, bought a new sofa, changed the curtains. But the apartment remained the apartment. The same ceilings, the same view from the window, the same corner of the kitchen where she used to like to sit with her laptop in the mornings. He didn't let himself think about it for too long. Alice found out about the sale by chance on a Thursday, at lunch, scrolling through her phone. An old acquaintance had shared a post with the note, "Great apartment, in case anyone's looking." She stopped her finger. Upper West Side. 3rd floor, high ceilings. A photo of the kitchen. Different furniture, different curtains, but the same corner, the same window, the same view of the tree-lined street. She looked at the screen for a few seconds. She thought about how she had stood in the hallway with her suitcase and heard from behind her, "You were never on my level. I just put up with it for too long." How she had closed the building door and walked to the taxi, and the taxi had driven through the New York night. And she had looked out the window and thought about nothing, because it was impossible to think. She thought about the rented room in Bushwick, about the smell of someone else's paint, about the birch tree in the courtyard, about how long it had seemed that there was nothing ahead, just emptiness. And then she thought about how all of that had come together into what she had now. She closed her phone and smiled. Not with schadenfreude, just the way you smile when something finally falls into place and no other feeling is necessary. The agency won George's bid at the end of October. It was a fair competition. 5 participants, a 40-page technical specification, a tight deadline. Alice and her team worked on the proposal intensely for a week, almost without a weekend. Kevin came up with the concept. Sophie wrote the copy. Megan created the presentation. Alice edited, integrated, and pushed for precision in every word. When the result came in an email saying, "Your proposal has been selected as the best," she read it, put her phone on the table, looked out the window, and then wrote to the team in their group chat. "We won." A second later, Kevin replied, "Yes." Another second later, Sophie sent 3 exclamation points, which was the maximum for her. Alice laughed. That evening, she texted Mark. He replied briefly, "Congratulations. Well deserved." Not, "I told you so." Not, "See?" Just congratulations. She liked that he didn't say, "See?" They signed the contract a week later. The first client meeting was in their new office in Nomad, where they had finally moved from the cramped space in the Flatiron district. The new office was on the 3rd floor with windows overlooking a courtyard, small, clean, with a long conference table and a bookshelf that Alice had brought from home. On the shelf were a few marketing books, a couple of novels, and a small ceramic mug that Sophie had given her for her birthday with the words, "Best Editor." The client, an impressive woman in her 50s, the company's CFO, came with an assistant, greeted them briefly, and looked around. "A small space you have here," she remarked. "Small," Alice agreed. "But all 5 of us know what we're doing." The woman looked at her, a little appraisingly, then with a hint of approval. "I like that," she said. "Let's begin." The meeting went well. Alice led it herself, clearly, to the point, with concrete proposals for each item on the agenda. When the client asked a question, she answered directly, without evasion. When she was unsure of something, she said, "I need to check with my team, I'll have an answer by Friday." No vagueness, no promising more than they could deliver. At the end, the client stood up and shook her hand. "We're in business," she said. When they had left, Kevin let out a quiet exhale from the corner. "Alice, weren't you nervous at all?" "I was nervous," she admitted. "Just not on the outside." In November, life settled into a rhythm she loved, busy but stable. Mornings at the office, working with the team, edits, calls. Evenings sometimes with clients, sometimes just home. Weekends with Mark, sometimes Jessica, sometimes just her and a book. She started seeing a therapist, not because things were bad, but because she understood. What had happened in her marriage with Ryan had left a mark, one that was interesting to study, not just to carry. The therapist, Dr. Hayes, a stern, attentive woman without a lot of extra words, once asked her, "What would it mean for you to completely let this go?" Alice thought honestly and answered, "Probably that his opinion of me would cease to have any meaning at all." "And now?" "Now. It's almost there," she said. Dr. Hayes nodded. "Almost is a lot." It was true. Almost was a lot. Mark told her about his mother one evening when they were at her place. A normal evening. She was reading in her armchair. He was sitting on the sofa nearby with his laptop, looking at something, occasionally saying something out loud about a project, an employee, the traffic. She would answer without looking up from her book. This was their rhythm, easy. Without the need to be looking at each other all the time. My mother wants to meet you, he said. Alice looked up. You've told her about me? Yes. What did you tell her? He thought for a second. That you do important work and that I'm happy when I'm with you. She looked at him. The lamp next to the sofa lit him from the side. He wasn't looking at her, but at his laptop, but there was a slight, almost invisible smile at the corner of his mouth. Are you deliberately looking at the screen while you say that? She asked. Yes, he admitted. Why? Because it's important to me. And when something is important, I'm not always good at looking people in the eye. Alice closed her book. She thought about what a different Alice would have said. The one who, 2 years ago, sat in a rented room smelling of someone else's paint and thought that normal relationships were something from another life, for other people. That Alice would have been scared of this conversation, would have started looking for a catch, or tensed up. What does this mean? Where is this going? What if this turns into something bad again? Now, she just felt a warmth. A quiet, steady warmth, the kind that doesn't flicker or go out. When should we go? She asked. Mark finally looked at her. She lives in the Hudson Valley. On the weekend, if you want. I want to. He nodded, looked back at the screen, but smiled openly this time. Not hiding it. You'll like her, he said. She's strict, but fair. Then we'll get along, Alice said. The Hudson Valley was quiet and truly autumnal. The kind of autumn that you rarely get in the city. Unhurried, smelling of apples and wood smoke, with the white steeples of churches over the river and yellow town squares where there was almost no one. They arrived on Saturday. Mark parked the car by an old wooden house on a quiet street and took a bag from the back seat. Something for tea he had bought at a bakery in the city, and some simple autumn flowers, orange chrysanthemums. You bring flowers for your mother, but not for me. Alice teased. I carry your bag, he replied, unfazed. She laughed. The door was opened by a short woman in her 70s, with a straight posture and neatly coiffed white hair, wearing a dark wool cardigan. Her gaze was attentive, without excess emotion. She looked at Mark briefly, familiarly, the way you look at your own, then at Alice. For a long time, without smiling, but without coldness. Come in, she said. Her name was Nora. She was the kind of person who doesn't waste words on ceremony, which is why she seemed strict until you realized that behind that economy of words was respect. They don't say unnecessary things, which means that when they do speak, it matters. Over tea, she asked Alice questions. About the agency, about her work, about what exactly she did. Not small talk, but substantive questions. How is the process structured? Who makes the decisions? How does she build relationships with clients? Alice answered clearly and with pleasure. She liked people who asked substantive questions. At one point, Nora looked at her son. She knows how to answer, she said. It sounded like a compliment. Mark pretended to study the bottom of his teacup. Later, they walked around the town. Nora knew it the way you know a place you've lived your whole life. Every alley, every church. The history of every building. She spoke quietly, without fanfare. Alice walked beside her and listened, and thought that this is probably what continuity looks like. Something passed down, not in words, but in the way a person stands on the earth. Mark walked a little behind. Alice turned around once. He was looking at both of them with an expression she couldn't name in a single word. Something calm and very much his own. The drive back was long. There was traffic on the highway, and they left after dark. Alice dozed in the passenger seat, then woke up. The lights of New York were already close. Mark drove in silence. Did you like her? He asked. Yes, Alice said. Very much. Why? She thought. She says what she thinks, without a filter. That can be inconvenient. It's always better than with a filter. He was quiet for a moment. She told me, while you were out of the room, he said, that I finally found my match. Alice looked straight ahead. At the lights of oncoming cars, at the dark sky over the highway. She's a strict woman, she said. Yes. Which means that's worth a lot. They entered New York. The city took them back with its familiar hum, traffic lights, familiar intersections. Winter arrived at the end of November. At first hesitantly, with wet snow that melted by noon, then decisively, with frost and white rooftops. New York is always a little quieter in the snow. Alice loved that. She loved walking to the office in the morning through the park, when the snow was still untrodden and lay smooth, and the air was cold and sharp, and everything looked as if it had just been made. By December, the agency had grown to 6 people. They hired another writer, a young guy named Tyler, who wrote quickly and accurately. The office in Nomad was starting to feel cramped. Alice was already looking at a larger space near Union Square, a bit more expensive, but with a separate conference room and a proper kitchen. One day in December, she was leading a meeting on a new project. A client from the banking sector, large, demanding, with details that had to be kept in mind. She stood at the whiteboard, laying out the structure, talking. The team listened, asked questions. Sophie took notes. Kevin occasionally nodded or shook his head and said, "Hang on, there's a nuance here." At one point, Alice caught Tyler's eye. He was looking at her with that particular expression people have in a new job when they're just starting to understand where they've landed. Something like, "Wow." She kept talking. Later, after the meeting, Kevin lingered by the board. "Alice," he said. "Yeah? Remember when we started? There were 3 of us, a table in a co-working space, 1 client, and a small one at that." "I remember. That was 2 years ago." "A little over 2, she corrected. "Right," he said. "A little over 2. He nodded, as if summing up something that didn't need words, and left. Alice looked at the board, at the colorful sticky notes with tasks, at the arrows between blocks, at the names of the people who worked with her. Kevin, Sophie, Megan, Tyler. 4 people who had come to work here, with her. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they chose to. She thought about what Ryan had said once, a long time ago, in that kitchen, in front of his partners. "It's amateurish. They won't take it." About the manuscript he had later thrown away, about her idea he hadn't let her finish. She thought about it calmly, the way you think about something long past, that no longer stings. Then she took an eraser and wiped the board clean for the new project. Closer to Christmas, she and Mark bought a tree. A small, real one that smelled of pine. They hauled it up to her apartment and set it up in a corner of the living room. Alice found a box of old ornaments in a closet, the ones she had moved from the rented room in Bushwick to Yorkville. Glass balls, a little worn, some from her childhood with chipped paint, and a few modern, transparent ones with snowflakes inside. Mark was on the sofa untangling a string of lights, methodically, without frustration, even though they were a mess, and watching Alice hang the ornaments. She did it meticulously. Stepping back, looking, moving them, looking again. "Takes a while," he noted. "But you get it right." "Who decides what's right?" "I do," she said. "It's my tree." "Ours," he corrected. She turned around. He said it simply, without subtext, without emphasis, as if it were self-evident. "Ours." She turned back to the tree and hung a glass ball, an old one with a bluish sheen, on a branch at the very edge. "Ours," she agreed. The lights were finally untangled. Mark wrapped them around the tree and plugged them in. The lights came on, small, warm, yellow, white. Alice turned off the floor lamp. They stood in the dark living room, lit only by the tree, and looked at it. "Nice," Mark said. "Yes," Alice agreed. That same night, late, she was scrolling through her phone, aimlessly, the way you do before sleep. News, someone's photo, an ad. Then, in an acquaintance's feed, a short post, without emotion. "Apartment for sale." A link to a listing. She tapped it. Upper West Side. 3rd floor. View of the park, high ceilings. The price was a little below market, which meant they wanted a quick sale. She looked at the photos. The kitchen, different furniture, different light. The living room, the same corner, the same windows. The bedroom, they hadn't even changed the wallpaper, it seemed. She scrolled to the end and closed the app. For a few seconds, she lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't thinking about him. She was thinking about the woman who had left this place with 2 suitcases in November 2 years ago. Who had driven through the New York night, unable to think, who had then lain in a strange room for a long time, staring at the ceiling just like this. Except back then, there was nothing good in the ceiling. And she thought about that same woman. Now. Here, in her own apartment, with a Christmas tree in the living room and a man beside her, falling asleep with his hand on her shoulder. With an agency that had grown from 3 people to 6. With a bid they had won fairly. With her mother in Syracuse, whom she now called just because, without counting the minutes or listening for footsteps in the hallway. With Jessica, whom she met every other week to talk about everything, and no one needed to know about it or could forbid it. Alice smiled. Not with schadenfreude, not with triumph. She just smiled, the way you smile when you understand something quiet and important. That life isn't a place where justice is distributed on demand. It's structured differently. It just moves. And if you move with it, without getting stuck where it hurts, sooner or later you end up where there's light. She hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't planned anything. She had just lived on. Day by day, choice by choice, text by text, meeting by meeting. And at some point, she found that she was standing exactly where she wanted to stand, and the past was left where it belonged. In the past.